I stood in my empty garage, staring down at the oil stain where something very expensive used to be parked. My phone buzzed relentlessly in my hand, angry messages from Italy flooding in, from my husband Patrick and his 28-year-old secretary Bethany. "Leah, what have you done? Call me back immediately." Another buzz. "This is insane. You can't just..." Another buzz. "We're flying back tonight." But I wasn't calling anyone back. Not anymore. I turned my phone face down on the workbench and smiled at that dark stain on the concrete floor. For 26 years, that spot had been occupied by Patrick's pride and joy, his pristine 1969 Corvette Stingray. The car he polished every weekend. The car he loved more than our anniversary dinners. The car that was apparently too powerful for someone like me to even sit in. See, Patrick always told me I was too old to travel, too fragile for adventure, too set in my ways to change. When I'd mentioned my dreams of seeing the Italian countryside or visiting those art galleries in Florence I'd read about since college, he'd give me that patronizing smile and pat my hand like I was a confused child. "Honey, you know how you get anxious on planes. Besides, all that walking would be too much for you at your age." At 58, I believed him. I thought my adventurous days were behind me. I thought I was too old to start over, too old to stand up for myself, too old to fight back. Well, it turned out there were some things you're never too old for. And revenge was definitely one of them. If you're enjoying this story of a woman who finally fought back, hit that subscribe button, because trust me, you're going to want to see how this ends. And let me ask you this. Have you ever had someone tell you that you were too old for something you really wanted to do? Drop a comment below, because I have a feeling I'm not the only one who's heard those words. But first, let me tell you how I got to this moment, standing in an empty garage with a phone full of panic messages from Italy, and why that oil stain represented the sweetest victory of my entire life. My name is Leah, and at 58, I thought I knew exactly my place in the world. I was Patrick's devoted wife, the supportive partner, the woman behind the successful man. For 26 years, that's all I'd been. I gave up everything for that role. My art career, gone before it even started. I'd graduated from college with a degree in fine arts, dreams of painting in studios flooded with natural light and having my own gallery someday. But 3 months after our wedding, Patrick sat me down at our kitchen table, with his business papers spread everywhere. "Leah, honey, I really need your help with the real estate business. Just temporarily, until I can afford to hire someone." Temporarily became permanently. 26 years permanently. I spent my days managing Patrick's appointments, organizing his files, answering his phone calls, and making sure every detail of his life ran like clockwork. I scheduled his meetings, handled his paperwork, even picked up his dry cleaning. My hands, which once held paintbrushes and created beautiful things, were now permanently stained with ink from filing his contracts and typing his reports. And through it all, I dreamed. I dreamed of the galleries in Florence I'd read about since art school. I dreamed of walking through the Uffizi, seeing Botticelli's paintings in person. I dreamed of the rolling hills of Tuscany, of little cafes where I could sketch the landscape. I dreamed of Italy like other people dream of winning the lottery. But whenever I mentioned these dreams to Patrick, he'd get that look. That sad, concerned expression that made me feel foolish for even thinking such thoughts. He'd shake his head slowly and sigh. "Honey, you know how you get anxious on planes. Remember that flight to my mother's funeral? You were white as a sheet." He'd reach over and pat my hand like I was a child who'd asked for something dangerous. "Besides, all that walking would be too much for you. You get tired just going grocery shopping." I believed him. God help me, I believed every word. I believed I was fragile. I believed my dreams were impractical, selfish even. I believed that my role was to make Patrick's life easier, smoother, more successful, while mine got smaller and smaller. I stopped mentioning Italy. I stopped talking about art. I even stopped going to the local art supply store because it made me too sad to see all those brushes and canvases I'd never use. By the time I turned 50, I'd convinced myself that dreaming was for younger women. Women who hadn't made the responsible choice to support their husband's career. Women who didn't understand what real love and sacrifice meant. What I didn't understand then was that I wasn't sacrificing for love. I was disappearing for convenience. Patrick's convenience. It wasn't just travel that Patrick deemed me too old for. Over the years, those two words became his favorite weapon against any spark of life I showed. Too old to go back to painting. You haven't touched a paintbrush in decades. Those classes are for young people trying to find themselves. Too old to learn new things. When I suggested getting a computer to help his business, he said, "Technology isn't for people like us. We're too set in our ways." Too old to have opinions about his business, even though I handled most of his administrative work for free. When I'd suggest expanding into commercial properties, he'd dismiss me. "Leave the business strategy to me. You just handle the filing." The worst part was how he humiliated me in public. At dinner parties, he'd turn my small mistakes into entertainment. If I forgot someone's name, he'd announce to the table, "You'll have to excuse Leah. She's having one of her senior moments again." Everyone would laugh awkwardly while my cheeks burned with shame. When I suggested redecorating our bedroom after 15 years, he didn't even look up from his newspaper. "We're not young anymore. We need to start acting our age. Decorating is for newlyweds, not people pushing 60. Pushing 60, as if 58 was 1 foot in the grave. Every dismissal chipped away at me. Every too old comment made me shrink smaller. I stopped suggesting things, stopped having ideas, stopped believing I had anything valuable to contribute beyond keeping his schedule organized. I started believing that 58 meant invisible, irrelevant, and past my prime. I looked in the mirror and saw an old woman who should be grateful for the quiet life Patrick had given me. What I didn't see was a woman who'd been systematically broken down, piece by piece, until she forgot she'd ever been whole. 3 months ago, everything changed with one announcement that should have been my first red flag. Patrick walked into the kitchen while I was making his coffee and casually said, "I'm taking a business trip to Italy next month, going to scout international properties with Bethany." My heart jumped. Italy, the country I'd been dreaming about for decades. "When do we leave?" Patrick laughed like I'd told the world's funniest joke. "We? This isn't a vacation, this is serious business. Besides, you know how you get overwhelmed in crowded places." "Patrick, I speak Italian. I studied it in college. I could be helpful." He gave me that patronizing smile I'd grown to hate. "Sweetheart, that was 40 years ago. This is high-level business negotiations, not ordering pasta." Something felt wrong in my gut, but I did what I'd been trained to do for 26 years. I pushed that feeling down and told myself I was being paranoid. The night before he left, I saw Patrick packing clothes I'd never seen before. Expensive cologne that wasn't his usual Old Spice, stylish shirts, designer jeans, a leather jacket that cost more than our monthly groceries. "Where did you get all these new clothes?" He spun around defensively. "I've had them for ages. You just don't pay attention." "I do all your laundry, Patrick. I've never seen any of this." "Jesus, are you interrogating me? I bought new clothes for an important trip. You're being so paranoid and suspicious. It's not attractive." I felt my cheeks burn with shame. He was right. I was being paranoid. Wasn't I? If you're starting to see the red flags I was blind to, make sure to subscribe because this story is about to take some incredible turns. And tell me, have you ever ignored your gut feeling about something important? Looking back, I wish I'd trusted mine sooner. But at the time, I convinced myself I was just being a worried, jealous wife. I had no idea my entire world was about to come crashing down. 2 days after Patrick left for Italy, I decided to organize his home office. It was something I did regularly, filing papers, organizing his desk, making sure everything was perfect for his return. I was going through his filing cabinet when I found a folder labeled Travel Plans. I figured it was his Italy itinerary, so I opened it to see if there was anything I needed to handle while he was away. What I found shattered my world completely. Printed emails, pages of them. But they weren't business emails. They were love letters between Patrick and Bethany. "Patrick, I can't stop thinking about our weekend at the lake house." The lake house, he told me, was too boring for a getaway. I kept reading, my heart pounding. "Can't wait to show you the real Italy, away from everything holding us back. Finally free to be ourselves without having to pretend." But the email that destroyed me was from just 1 week before he left. Bethany asked, "Are you sure Leah won't get suspicious?" Patrick's response. Don't worry about Leah. She's so set in her routine, she'll never suspect. Besides, she's gotten so boring and old lately, she'll probably be relieved I'm out of her hair. Boring and old. Those words hit like a physical blow. There were hotel confirmations for romantic restaurants, couples spa treatments, wine tastings, all the things Patrick said I was too old to enjoy. And a receipt from Tiffany & Co. for a diamond necklace purchased with our joint credit card. The same card he'd lectured me about using for unnecessary purchases. I sat on his office floor, surrounded by evidence of his betrayal, and cried until I couldn't breathe. 26 years of believing I wasn't good enough, young enough, interesting enough. And all along he'd been living the adventure and passion he said I was too old for, with another woman. But as I sat there holding proof of his lies, something inside me began to change. The woman who'd accepted too old for everything was about to discover she wasn't too old for revenge. I sat in that office for hours, surrounded by the wreckage of my marriage, crying until I had no tears left. The sun moved across the sky, shadows shifted on the walls, and still I sat there, holding those emails like evidence at a crime scene. But then something extraordinary happened. Something I hadn't felt in decades. Instead of falling apart completely, I got angry. Really, truly angry. Not the quiet, swallowed anger I'd carried for years. Not the resigned disappointment I'd learned to live with. This was pure, blazing fury that started in my chest and spread through my entire body like wildfire. For the first time in decades, I felt fire in my veins instead of resignation. I picked up my phone and called my sister Janet. She answered on the first ring, probably expecting our usual pleasant check-in call. Janet, I said, my voice shaking but strong, Patrick's having an affair. The silence on the other end lasted maybe 3 seconds before Janet exploded. That bastard. Leah, I knew it. I've been telling you for years that something was wrong with how he treats you. He's in Italy with her right now, his secretary, 28 years old. Oh, honey, I'm so sorry, but you know what? I'm not surprised. The way he's been controlling you, dismissing you, making you feel like you're not good enough. This is exactly what men like that do. Janet had always been the bold one, the sister who spoke her mind and never let anyone push her around. The sister Patrick had always said was a bad influence on me. Leah, she continued, her voice fierce and protective, listen to me carefully. You are not too old for anything. You're too smart to stay married to a man who makes you feel like you are. Those words hit me like lightning. Too smart to stay married to a man who makes you feel like you are. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in 26 years. I made a decision without consulting Patrick first, without asking his permission, without worrying about what he would think or say or do. I walked into the garage and really looked at his 1969 Corvette Stingray. The car he polished every weekend while I did laundry. The car he'd spent more money on than our last 5 anniversaries combined. The car he'd taken on weekend trips with his brother, while telling me I was too fragile for road trips. I ran my hand along its pristine red paint, thinking about all the times he'd told me not to touch it, not to even sit in it, because I might damage the leather seats. This car represented everything Patrick valued more than our marriage. His freedom, his youth, his escape from the boring, old wife who was apparently cramping his style. Standing there in that garage, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Power. Choice. The absolute certainty that I deserved better than this. Patrick thought I was too old to fight back, too set in my ways to change, too weak to survive without him. He was about to learn how wrong he was. While Patrick was living it up in Italy with Bethany, posting photos of romantic dinners on his barely private social media, I was having my own renaissance. But I wasn't sitting around crying into tissues like some abandoned housewife. I was planning. The morning after finding those emails, I did something that felt like the most rebellious act of my adult life. I enrolled in painting classes at the community college, something I'd wanted to do for years. I started a garden in our backyard, planting sunflowers, lavender, and roses that would bloom long after this marriage was over. Every time I dug my hands into that soil, I felt more alive than I had in years. I reconnected with friends Patrick thought were bad influences. My college roommate Sarah, who'd become a divorce attorney. My neighbor Diana, who'd always invited me to book club meetings, Patrick called gossip sessions. These women welcomed me back like I'd never been gone, and through their eyes, I remembered who Leah was before she became Patrick's wife. I was smart. I'd graduated summa cum laude. I was creative, funny, and certainly not too old for anything that mattered. If you're rooting for me to get the revenge Patrick deserves, make sure you subscribe because what I did next will shock you. And tell me in the comments, have you ever suddenly remembered who you used to be before someone else tried to change you? But the most important thing I rediscovered, I was definitely not too old to make some very important phone calls. First, Sarah, who said adultery would affect alimony significantly. Second, a private investigator specializing in cheating spouses. Third, the bank about our joint accounts. And fourth, the one that made me smile, a classic car appraiser who specialized in vintage Corvettes. Patrick thought I was too boring to be suspicious, too old to be resourceful, and too dependent to survive without him. He was about to discover that the woman he'd underestimated for 26 years had been taking very careful notes. The more I rediscovered myself, the clearer my next steps became. I wasn't the confused, scatterbrained woman Patrick had convinced me I was. I was methodical, strategic, and much smarter than he'd ever given me credit for. I gathered every piece of evidence of Patrick's affair and organized it like the business professional I'd been before I gave up my career. Printed emails, credit card statements, hotel receipts, screenshots of his Italy posts. I put it all in a manila folder labeled Evidence of Adultery and took it to Sarah's law office. "This is some of the most thorough documentation I've ever seen," she said. "In our state, adultery affects alimony arrangements significantly, and using marital funds for his affair? That's going to cost him dearly." Then I did something Patrick always said I was too scatterbrained to handle. I managed our finances. All of them. I transferred exactly half of our savings into my own account, which was completely legal. I canceled the credit cards he'd been using to wine and dine Bethany. I put a freeze on major withdrawals from our joint accounts. The next time he tried to buy his girlfriend jewelry, those cards would be declined. My favorite power move was changing the locks on our house, something I was legally entitled to do since my name was on the deed too. Every action I took felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. Every decision I made without Patrick's permission proved I wasn't the helpless woman he'd trained me to believe I was. For 26 years, Patrick had convinced me I needed him to survive. But sitting in my newly secured house, surrounded by evidence folders and financial documents, with my lawyer on speed dial, I realized something that made me smile. Patrick wasn't just wrong about me being too old for dreams. He was wrong about everything. And he was about to find out exactly how wrong he'd been. When Patrick returned from his romantic Italian getaway, the reality check was swift and brutal. I watched from the kitchen window as his taxi pulled up. He looked tan and relaxed, probably still floating on his romantic high from 2 weeks with Bethany. That's when I stood in our empty garage, watching him discover exactly what happens when you underestimate someone you've called too old for 26 years. I'll never forget the sound he made when he opened the garage door. The sound of a man's world crashing down. His precious 1969 Corvette Stingray was gone. Nothing left but that dark oil stain on the concrete floor. "Where's my car?" He ran around that empty garage like a madman, then spotted the envelope taped to the front door. Divorce papers, along with printed copies of every email I'd found between him and Bethany. When he finally came inside, he went through every emotion imaginable. Denial. "You can't just sell my car." Anger. "That's invasion of privacy." Bargaining. "We can work this out. Maybe we can take that Italy trip you wanted." But the most telling moment was when his manipulation tactics failed. His voice got soft and condescending, the way it always did when he wanted to make me feel small. "Come on, honey. You know you can't handle being alone. You need me." After everything he'd done, everything I'd accomplished in the 2 weeks he'd been gone, he still thought I was the same broken-down woman he could control with fear and self-doubt. If you want to see how this story ends, make sure you subscribe because the final showdown is coming. And tell me, what's the most empowering thing you've ever done when someone underestimated you? Drop your stories in the comments. standing there, looking at this man who'd stolen 26 years of my life. I realized he was right about one thing. I did need something, but it wasn't him. I needed him gone. The aftermath was more satisfying than I could have imagined. Within a week of Patrick's return, I got the phone call that made all of this worthwhile. It was Patrick, actually crying. "Leah, Bethany left me. She won't return my calls. She blocked me on everything." Apparently, sweet little Bethany had done some quick math and realized she wasn't getting the sugar daddy fantasy she'd signed up for. Instead of a successful businessman who could buy her Tiffany necklaces, she got a middle-aged man facing an expensive divorce with frozen assets and canceled credit cards. The irony was delicious. Patrick had left his devoted wife of 26 years for a woman who abandoned him the moment his bank account dried up. But that was just the beginning. Word spreads fast in real estate circles. His business partner suspended their partnership. His biggest clients fired him, saying they couldn't trust a man who lies to his own wife to handle their biggest transactions. Patrick's business, which he'd spent 15 years building, crumbled almost overnight. The man who'd spent years telling me I was too old, too boring, too irrelevant to matter, discovered that his reputation, the thing he'd valued more than our marriage, was just as fragile as he'd always told me I was. By month's end, Patrick was living in a studio apartment, driving a beat-up Honda Civic, and begging his mother for money to pay his divorce lawyer. Meanwhile, I was living in our beautiful house, tending my blooming garden, painting in my new studio, and planning my trip to Italy with Janet. Justice, it turned out, wasn't just sweet. It was absolutely perfect. 6 months later, I was painting in my sunlit studio. The spare room Patrick always said was too small for anything useful. Turns out, it was perfect for everything I'd been dreaming of. My garden was blooming with 8-foot sunflowers he called too much work, and roses he said were impractical. Every morning, I took my coffee outside and sat among the beauty I'd created with my own hands. My art instructor, a woman in her 70s, laughed when I told her Patrick thought I was too old to start painting. "Honey," she said, "I didn't pick up a paintbrush until I was 65. The best time to start anything is now." And I was planning that trip to Italy I was supposedly too old for. Janet and I had booked 3 weeks, twice as long as Patrick's pathetic 10 days. We were seeing Florence, Rome, Venice, and those Tuscan hills I'd dreamed about since college. The woman who was too fragile for travel had booked walking tours through ancient Roman ruins. The woman who was too boring had planned the trip of a lifetime. I wasn't angry anymore. I was grateful. Grateful that at 58, I learned the most important lesson of my life. The only person who gets to decide if you're too old for your dreams is you. And I had decided I was just getting started. If this story inspired you to stop letting anyone tell you that you're too old for anything, make sure you subscribe for more stories about women who refuse to accept other people's limitations. And tell me in the comments, what's one thing you've always wanted to do, but someone convinced you that you were too old for? Because trust me, you're not. Patrick had spent 26 years trying to convince me that my best days were behind me. But sitting in my studio, surrounded by my paintings and my newfound freedom, I realized something that made me smile. My best days weren't behind me, they were just beginning. And this time, I was the only one deciding what came next.